Dr. Margaret Sullivan had been working as the chief curator of historical photography at the Boston Public Library's special collections for nearly 3 decades when she encountered the photograph that would force her to question the fundamental nature of time, reality, and the persistence of consciousness across impossible temporal boundaries. The image had arrived as part of a massive donation from the estate of deceased antiquarian Cornelius Whitman, whose collection contained over 10,000 photographs spanning the 19th and early 20th centuries. The photograph in question appeared to be a typical portrait from 1915, showing a young girl of perhaps 10 years old sitting in a wooden chair in what looked like a photographer's studio. She wore a white dress with intricate lacework. Her dark hair was carefully arranged in the Gibson girl style popular during that era, and her expression held the serious composure that children often adopted for formal photographs when exposure times were long and movement had to be minimized. In her arms, the girl held a large tabby cat, its fur marked with distinctive stripes, and its yellow eyes gazing directly at the camera with the alertness characteristic of felines who were unaccustomed to the bright lights and strange apparatus of early 20th century photography studios. The cat appeared well-fed and healthy, suggesting it was a beloved family pet rather than a stray animal that had wandered into the photographer's establishment. The notation on the back of the photograph, written in faded brown ink, read, "Miss Eleanor Ashworth and Whiskers, September 12, 1915, Boston, Massachusetts." According to the accompanying documentation from the Whitman estate, the photograph had been purchased at an estate sale in 1987, along with several other images that had belonged to the Ashworth family of Beacon Hill. But when Dr. Sullivan examined the photograph using the library's high-resolution digital scanning equipment, she discovered something that made her question everything she thought she understood about photographic preservation and the nature of reality itself. As she zoomed in on the cat's eyes, enhancing the image to examine the fine details of the animal's features, she noticed something that should have been impossible given the technology available in 1915. The cat's eyes were reflecting not just the photographer's lights and studio equipment, but also images that clearly belonged to a different time period entirely. In the golden irises, Dr. Sullivan could make out the reflection of what appeared to be modern buildings, automobiles from the 1950s and 1960s, and even what looked like people wearing clothing styles that wouldn't be invented for decades after the photograph was taken. Dr. Sullivan rubbed her eyes and looked again, thinking that fatigue or eye strain might be causing her to see patterns that weren't actually present in the photograph, but the reflections remained consistent and clear, showing scenes that were unmistakably from periods long after 1915. The cat's eyes seemed to be functioning as windows into different eras, displaying images from across the entire 20th century. More disturbing still, the reflections in the cat's eyes appeared to be moving. As Dr. Sullivan watched the enhanced digital image, the scenes reflected in the animal's gaze shifted and changed, showing different locations, time periods, and events, as if the cat were observing the passage of decades in real time. The automobile styles progressed from early 20th century models to modern vehicles, the clothing changed from decade to decade, and the buildings evolved from Victorian architecture to contemporary skyscrapers. Dr. Sullivan immediately contacted her colleague, Dr. James Fletcher, a specialist in historical photography authentication at Harvard University, requesting his urgent assistance in examining what she was beginning to believe might be the most important photographic discovery of her career. Dr. Fletcher arrived at the Boston Public Library the next morning, bringing sophisticated digital analysis equipment and a team of graduate students who specialized in detecting photographic anomalies and authentication challenges. Dr. Fletcher's initial examination confirmed Dr. Sullivan's findings. The cat's eyes were indeed reflecting images from time periods that extended far beyond 1915. Using spectral analysis and digital enhancement techniques, his team was able to isolate and catalogue over 200 distinct temporal scenes reflected in the animal's gaze, spanning from the 1920s through what appeared to be the early 21st century. This violates every principle of physics and photography that we understand, Dr. Fletcher told Dr. Sullivan after completing his preliminary analysis. Light from the 1950s and 1960s cannot have been present in a 1915 photographer's studio. What we're seeing in this photograph is scientifically impossible, Yet the evidence is undeniable. The research team began documenting the temporal sequences visible in the cat's eyes, creating a comprehensive catalogue of the different time periods and locations that appeared to be reflected in the animal's gaze. The images showed a progression through decades of American history, including significant events, changing fashions, evolving technology, and the gradual transformation of Boston's urban landscape. Most remarkably, many of the reflected scenes appeared to be taking place in locations that were geographically connected to the original 1915 photograph. The team could identify specific Boston neighborhoods, landmarks, and buildings that had changed dramatically over the decades, as if the cat were observing the same locations across multiple time periods simultaneously. Dr. Sullivan decided to research the background of Eleanor Ashworth and her family, hoping to find historical context that might explain the impossible temporal reflections in her cat's eyes. Using genealogical records, census data, and local historical archives, she traced the Ashworth family's presence in Boston from the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century. The Ashworth family had been prominent members of Boston society, with significant business interests in shipping, textiles, and later in emerging technologies like radio and early electronics. Eleanor's father, Charles Ashworth, had been an inventor and entrepreneur who held patents on several devices related to electromagnetic communication and early broadcasting equipment. Most intriguingly, Dr. Sullivan discovered that Charles Ashworth had been experimenting with what he called temporal photography in the years before his daughter's portrait was taken. According to patent applications filed between 1912 and 1914, Ashworth had been developing photographic techniques that he claimed could capture images across different time periods simultaneously. Ashworth's patent applications described a process that involved the use of specialized electromagnetic fields in conjunction with traditional photographic chemicals to create what he termed chronographic plates. These plates were designed to be sensitive, not just to light from the immediate environment, but also to what Ashworth called temporal resonances that could reveal scenes from past and future time periods. Dr. Sullivan found additional documentation indicating that Charles Ashworth had been corresponding with Albert Einstein during the period when the physicist was developing his theories of relativity. The letters, preserved in the archives of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, revealed that Ashworth was attempting to apply Einstein's theoretical work about the nature of time to practical photographic applications. According to the correspondence, Ashworth believed that time was not linear, but rather existed as multiple layers that could be accessed simultaneously under the right conditions. He theorized that certain electromagnetic phenomena could create windows between different temporal layers, allowing observers to witness events from multiple time periods at once. Einstein's responses to Ashworth's letters were diplomatic but skeptical, acknowledging the inventor's enthusiasm, while gently suggesting that his theories about temporal photography were not supported by current understanding of physics. However, Einstein did encourage Ashworth to continue his experiments, noting that scientific progress often required individuals who were willing to explore ideas that seemed impossible to their contemporaries. Dr. Sullivan discovered that Ashworth had indeed conducted extensive experiments with temporal photography in his private laboratory, located in the basement of the family's Beacon Hill mansion. The laboratory had been equipped with electromagnetic generators, specialized cameras, and chemical processing equipment that Ashworth had designed specifically for his chronographic research. The 1915 photograph of Eleanor and her cat had apparently been taken using one of Ashworth's experimental chronographic plates, which might explain why the cat's eyes were reflecting images from multiple time periods. If Ashworth's theories about temporal resonances were correct, the electromagnetic fields in his laboratory could have created conditions that allowed the photographic plate to capture visual information from across decades of time. Dr. Fletcher's team conducted detailed analysis of the photographic plate itself, using electron microscopy and chemical composition studies to determine whether the image contained any unusual properties that might support Ashworth's temporal photography theories. Their examination revealed that the photographic emulsion contained metallic compounds and electromagnetic residues that were not typical of standard 1915 photography techniques. Most significantly, the areas of the plate corresponding to the cat's eyes showed electromagnetic signatures that were unlike anything in the rest of the photograph. These regions displayed crystalline structures and electromagnetic patterns that suggested they had been exposed to fields far more complex than simple visible light. Dr. Sullivan contacted Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a physicist from MIT who specialized in temporal mechanics and the relationship between consciousness and time perception. Dr. Rodriguez arrived in Boston with equipment designed to measure temporal fluctuations and detect any ongoing electromagnetic phenomena associated with the photograph. Dr. Rodriguez's measurements revealed that the photograph was indeed emitting low-level electromagnetic pulses in patterns that suggested some form of temporal instability. The pulses were strongest in the areas corresponding to the cat's eyes and appeared to be synchronized with natural cycles that related to both solar activity and lunar phases. According to Dr. Rodriguez's preliminary analysis, the photograph might be functioning as a form of temporal antenna, continuing to receive and display visual information from different time periods more than a century after it was originally created. The electromagnetic fields that Charles Ashworth had used in his experimental photography appeared to have created a permanent window between temporal layers. The research team began monitoring the photograph around the clock, documenting changes in the temporal reflections visible in the cat's eyes. They discovered that the scenes shifted according to predictable patterns, with certain time periods becoming more visible during specific environmental conditions such as solar flares, magnetic storms, and atmospheric disturbances. During periods of high electromagnetic activity, the cat's eyes would display particularly clear images from the 1940s and 1960s, eras that seemed to have the strongest temporal resonance with the original 1915 photograph. During calmer electromagnetic conditions, the reflections would show scenes from more recent decades, including what appeared to be events that had not yet occurred at the time of observation. Dr. Sullivan realized that they might be witnessing not just a window into the past, but also glimpses of potential future events. The cat's eyes seemed to be displaying a complete temporal spectrum that included past, present, and future, all visible simultaneously through the electromagnetic anomaly that Charles Ashworth had unknowingly created. The team documented several instances where the future scenes reflected in the cat's eyes proved to be accurate predictions of events that occurred weeks or months later. Stock market changes, weather patterns, and even personal events in the lives of the researchers were reflected in the cat's gaze before they actually took place. Dr. Rodriguez theorized that consciousness itself might play a role in determining which temporal scenes became visible in the photograph. The cat's awareness, combined with the electromagnetic fields created by Ashworth's experimental equipment, might have created a form of temporal consciousness that could observe across multiple time periods simultaneously. To test this theory, the research team began conducting experiments in which they focused their attention on specific time periods while observing the cat's eyes. They discovered that their intentions and interests could indeed influence which temporal scenes became most clearly visible, suggesting that consciousness was actively involved in determining the photograph's temporal displays. Dr. Sullivan contacted the Ashworth family descendants, hoping to learn more about Eleanor and her cat Whiskers, and to determine whether any family members had experienced unusual phenomena related to the 1915 photograph. Her research led her to Margaret Ashworth Chen, Eleanor's great-granddaughter, who still lived in the Boston area and had inherited many of her great-grandfather's documents and inventions. Margaret revealed that the Ashworth family had indeed experienced strange occurrences related to Charles Ashworth's temporal photography experiments for several generations. Family members reported seeing brief glimpses of deceased relatives in mirrors and windows, experiencing vivid dreams about future events that later proved accurate, and sensing the presence of family members from different time periods during important family gatherings. Most significantly, Margaret possessed several other photographs that had been taken using Charles Ashworth's chronographic plates, all of which displayed similar temporal anomalies. These images showed various family members and pets whose eyes or reflective surfaces contained scenes from multiple time periods, creating a collection of temporal windows that spanned nearly a century of family history. Dr. Sullivan's examination of the additional chronographic photographs revealed that Charles Ashworth had successfully created multiple temporal viewing devices, each focused on different aspects of time and consciousness. Some photographs showed past events with remarkable clarity, others displayed probable future scenarios, and a few seemed to capture moments that existed outside of normal temporal sequence entirely. The research attracted international attention as physicists, historians, and consciousness researchers struggled to understand the implications of Ashworth's temporal photography achievements. If consciousness could indeed interact with electromagnetic fields to create windows between different time periods, it suggested revolutionary possibilities for understanding the nature of time, memory, and human awareness. Dr. Rodriguez established a research partnership with CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, to study the quantum mechanical principles that might explain how Charles Ashworth's experiments had achieved temporal viewing capabilities. The collaboration led to breakthrough theoretical work on the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic fields, and the structure of time itself. Meanwhile, Dr. Sullivan worked with Margaret Ashworth Chen to create a comprehensive archive of Charles Ashworth's research and inventions. The archive included his correspondence with Einstein, his experimental notes, blueprints for his electromagnetic equipment, and documentation of his temporal photography techniques. The archive revealed that Ashworth had been years ahead of his time in understanding the relationship between consciousness and temporal perception. His theories about the layered nature of time and the possibility of simultaneous observation across multiple temporal periods had anticipated developments in quantum physics that wouldn't be accepted by mainstream science for decades. Dr. Sullivan organized the first international conference on temporal photography, bringing together researchers from around the world who were investigating similar phenomena. The conference revealed that Charles Ashworth had not been alone in his temporal research, and that inventors and scientists in several countries had been conducting parallel experiments during the early 20th century. The conference documented cases of temporal photography from Germany, France, and Russia, suggesting that the period between 1910 and 1920 had been particularly favorable for temporal research, possibly due to unique electromagnetic conditions that had existed during that era. Several of these international cases involved animals whose eyes or reflective surfaces displayed temporal anomalies similar to those visible in the Eleanor Ashworth photograph. Dr. Sullivan's research team discovered that cats in particular seemed to be especially sensitive to temporal electromagnetic fields. Their unique neurological structure and heightened electromagnetic sensitivity appeared to make them ideal subjects for temporal photography, with their eyes serving as natural temporal viewing devices when exposed to appropriate electromagnetic conditions. The team conducted experiments with contemporary cats using reconstructions of Charles Ashworth's electromagnetic equipment. While they were unable to fully replicate his temporal photography techniques, they did achieve limited success in creating temporal reflections in the eyes of cats who were exposed to specific electromagnetic field patterns. These experiments suggested that the temporal viewing phenomenon was reproducible under the right conditions, though modern attempts lacked the clarity and temporal range of Ashworth's original work. The difference might have been due to changes in global electromagnetic conditions, the loss of specific knowledge that Ashworth had not documented, or the unique consciousness of his daughter Eleanor and her cat, Whiskers. Dr. Rodriguez's theoretical work suggested that the consciousness of both the human subject and the animal companion might have been crucial factors in creating successful temporal viewing devices. The emotional bond between Eleanor and her cat could have created a form of consciousness resonance that amplified the temporal effects of her father's electromagnetic equipment. The research team began investigating other historical cases of unusual human-animal bonds, looking for evidence of temporal phenomena that might have been overlooked or misunderstood by previous generations. They discovered dozens of cases involving people and their pets who had reportedly experienced shared visions, predictive dreams, and apparent communication across temporal boundaries. Dr. Sullivan established the Institute for Temporal Consciousness Studies, the first research facility dedicated to understanding the relationship between consciousness, electromagnetic fields, and temporal perception. The institute was housed in a specially designed building that provided optimal electromagnetic environments for conducting temporal research while protecting researchers and subjects from potentially harmful effects. The Eleanor Ashworth photograph became the Institute's foundational artifact, serving as both a research subject and a tool for training new researchers in temporal observation techniques. The cat's eyes continued to display temporal scenes from across more than a century of history, providing an unprecedented window into the passage of time and the evolution of human consciousness. Dr. Sullivan's team developed protocols for safe temporal viewing, establishing guidelines that protected researchers from the psychological effects of observing multiple time periods simultaneously. Extended exposure to temporal viewing could cause disorientation, temporal displacement syndrome, and difficulty distinguishing between past, present, and future events. The Institute attracted students and researchers from around the world who were interested in exploring the frontiers of consciousness and temporal research. Graduate programs in temporal studies were established, offering coursework in electromagnetic consciousness theory, temporal viewing techniques, and the historical applications of time-based research. Eleanor Ashworth's photograph became the subject of extensive documentation, with researchers creating detailed catalogues of the temporal scenes visible in her cat's eyes. The catalogue became a valuable historical resource, providing visual documentation of American life across more than a century of social, technological, and cultural change. The temporal scenes reflected in Whisker's eyes offered unique perspectives on historical events, often showing aspects of daily life and social conditions that had not been preserved in traditional historical documentation. The cat's temporal viewing provided insights into how ordinary people had lived, worked, and related to each other during different historical periods. Dr. Sullivan collaborated with historians to develop new research methodologies that incorporated temporal viewing as a legitimate historical research tool. The techniques allowed historians to observe historical events directly rather than relying solely on written documents and artifacts, revolutionizing the field of historical research. The Institute also established programs for training temporal viewers, individuals who could interpret and analyze the complex temporal information displayed in Ashworth's chronographic photographs. These viewers required special training to handle the psychological challenges of observing multiple time periods simultaneously while maintaining their connection to present-day reality. Dr. Rodriguez's continued research revealed that temporal viewing might represent a natural human capability that had been suppressed by cultural conditioning and technological interference. Indigenous cultures around the world maintained traditions of temporal awareness that suggested human consciousness had originally possessed the ability to perceive across multiple time periods. The research team documented cases of individuals who had spontaneously developed temporal viewing abilities after exposure to the Eleanor Ashworth photograph or other chronographic images. These individuals reported enhanced intuition, predictive abilities, and awareness of historical events they had never studied through conventional means. Margaret Ashworth Chen became the Institute's primary liaison with the surviving Ashworth family, helping researchers understand the family history and cultural context that had made Charles Ashworth's temporal photography possible. Her insights proved crucial for understanding how consciousness, family relationships, and electromagnetic technology had combined to create the temporal viewing phenomenon. The Institute established archives for preserving and studying temporal photography artifacts from around the world. The collection grew to include hundreds of chronographic images from different time periods and cultures, creating the world's first comprehensive library of temporal viewing devices. Dr. Sullivan organized traveling exhibitions that allowed the public to experience temporal viewing in controlled environments. These exhibitions provided educational opportunities while generating support for continued research into the relationship between consciousness and temporal perception. The success of the temporal viewing exhibitions led to the development of therapeutic applications for people dealing with trauma, grief, and temporal displacement disorders. The ability to observe past and future events in controlled settings provided new methods for processing difficult experiences and developing healthier relationships with time and memory. Dr. Rodriguez established research partnerships with major universities and government agencies, interested in the potential applications of temporal viewing technology. The research attracted funding from organizations interested in developing temporal viewing for intelligence gathering, historical research, and scientific investigation. However, the Institute maintained strict ethical guidelines about the use of temporal viewing technology, ensuring that the research remained focused on understanding consciousness and time rather than developing tools for surveillance or control. The researchers recognized that temporal viewing represented a fundamental expansion of human awareness that required careful consideration of its implications for society and individual privacy. Eleanor Ashworth's photograph continued to serve as the primary example of successful temporal photography, demonstrating that consciousness could indeed transcend normal temporal limitations when supported by appropriate technology and understanding. The cat's eyes remained active temporal windows, continuing to display scenes from across more than a century of history, while occasionally showing glimpses of potential future events. Dr. Sullivan often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a routine examination of a historical photograph and evolved into groundbreaking research that was reshaping human understanding of consciousness, time, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. The little girl and her cat had become proof that time was far more flexible and accessible than previous generations had imagined. The Institute for Temporal Consciousness Studies continued to grow, establishing satellite facilities around the world that investigated temporal phenomena in different cultural and geographical contexts. Eleanor Ashworth's case provided the foundation for understanding how consciousness could interact with time in ways that transcended conventional limitations. As the research progressed, Dr. Sullivan began to understand that Charles Ashworth's temporal photography had not been simply a technological achievement, but rather a breakthrough in human evolution that demonstrated new possibilities for consciousness and perception. The bond between his daughter Eleanor and her cat Whiskers had served as a bridge between different forms of awareness, creating windows into the full spectrum of time that proved consciousness was capable of far more than most people ever imagined possible. The photograph that had started as a simple family portrait had become a doorway to understanding time itself, proving that some discoveries are too important to be confined within the boundaries of any single scientific discipline. Eleanor and Whiskers had opened pathways to new forms of awareness that demonstrated the unlimited potential of consciousness when freed from conventional assumptions about the nature of time, reality, and the boundaries of human perception. But the story of Eleanor Ashworth and her temporal viewing cat was far from over. 5 years after the initial discovery of the temporal reflections in Whiskers' eyes, Dr. Sullivan received an urgent call from Margaret Ashworth Chen that would transform their understanding of Charles Ashworth's experiments from historical curiosity to active, ongoing phenomenon that continued to evolve more than a century after its creation. Dr. Sullivan, Margaret's voice carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension that had become familiar during their years of collaboration. Something extraordinary is happening with great-grandfather's equipment. We found his original laboratory in the basement, and it's becoming active again. The machines are turning on by themselves, and we're seeing things that shouldn't be possible. Dr. Sullivan immediately assembled her research team and traveled to the Ashworth family mansion on Beacon Hill, a Victorian structure that had been in the family for over 150 years. Margaret led them through the main house to a concealed door behind the library that opened onto stone steps, descending into what had once been Charles Ashworth's private laboratory. The basement laboratory was a time capsule from 1915 containing brass and copper machinery that hummed with electromagnetic energy despite having been abandoned for over a century. Glass tubes filled with unknown chemicals glowed with phosphorescent light, and complex electromagnetic coils created patterns of energy that danced through the air like aurora displays in miniature. At the center of the laboratory stood Charles Ashworth's masterpiece, a camera apparatus unlike anything that had existed in 1915 or that existed in contemporary technology. The device combined photographic elements with electromagnetic generators, quantum resonance chambers, and what appeared to be crystalline consciousness amplifiers that somehow focused human awareness into concentrated temporal viewing beams. Dr. Rodriguez immediately began taking electromagnetic readings, discovering that the laboratory was generating energy signatures that exceeded anything they had previously measured in connection with the temporal photography research. The equipment appeared to be drawing power from sources that conventional science couldn't identify, possibly tapping into fundamental forces that Charles Ashworth had discovered but never fully documented. Margaret explained that the laboratory had begun showing signs of activity 3 weeks earlier, coinciding with unusual electromagnetic disturbances that had been detected globally by scientists monitoring space weather and atmospheric phenomena. The timing suggested that Charles Ashworth's equipment was responding to cosmic events that created optimal conditions for temporal viewing. As the research team examined the active laboratory equipment, they discovered that the original Eleanor and Whiskers photograph was not an isolated achievement, but rather one element in a comprehensive temporal viewing system that Charles Ashworth had been developing throughout the 1910s. The laboratory contained dozens of photographic plates that showed temporal reflections, each focused on different time periods and aspects of human consciousness development. Dr. Sullivan documented plates that displayed the history of the Ashworth family across multiple generations, showing ancestors and descendants in temporal sequences that revealed the evolution of human awareness and technological capability over centuries. Other plates seemed to focus on global events, displaying wars, discoveries, social movements, and cultural changes as they unfolded across decades of human history. Most remarkably, several plates appeared to be showing real-time events occurring in different locations around the world. The temporal viewing system had evolved beyond historical observation to become a form of consciousness-based surveillance that could observe current events regardless of geographical distance or physical barriers. Dr. Rodriguez discovered that the laboratory equipment was responding to the presence of the research team, with the temporal viewing displays becoming clearer and more detailed when multiple conscious observers focused their attention on the photographic plates. This suggested that consciousness itself was an active component in the temporal viewing process, with human awareness serving as both power source and focusing mechanism for the electromagnetic technology. The team began documenting the real-time temporal viewing capabilities, observing events as they occurred in distant locations with remarkable clarity and detail. They witnessed traffic accidents moments before they happened, observed private conversations in government buildings, and saw personal interactions in homes and offices around the world. The implications were staggering. Charles Ashworth had apparently created a technology that could observe any location or time period through the focused application of human consciousness and electromagnetic manipulation. The device represented capabilities that exceeded modern surveillance technology, while operating through principles that conventional science was only beginning to understand. Dr. Sullivan contacted Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in consciousness research from Stanford University, requesting her assistance in understanding how human awareness could be technologically amplified to achieve temporal and spatial viewing capabilities. Dr. Foster arrived in Boston with equipment designed to measure consciousness states and neural activity during paranormal experiences. Dr. Foster's initial examination revealed that individuals who used Charles Ashworth's temporal viewing equipment experienced dramatic changes in brain activity, with neural patterns that resembled those associated with deep meditation, psychic experiences, and mystical consciousness states. The equipment appeared to be inducing altered states of awareness that allowed human consciousness to transcend normal limitations of time and space. The research team began conducting controlled experiments with volunteers who were willing to use the temporal viewing equipment under scientific observation. The volunteers reported experiencing expanded awareness that allowed them to observe events across vast distances and time periods while maintaining their normal conscious identity and memory. Most volunteers described the temporal viewing experience as similar to lucid dreaming, but with far greater clarity and control than normal dream states. They could direct their attention to specific locations or time periods, observe events in detail, and remember their experiences clearly after returning to normal consciousness. Dr. Foster documented several cases where volunteers using the temporal viewing equipment provided accurate information about events occurring in distant locations that they had no normal way of knowing. The accuracy of their remote observations confirmed that the equipment was indeed providing genuine access to expanded consciousness capabilities. However, the research also revealed potential dangers associated with extended use of the temporal viewing technology. Volunteers who spent more than an hour using the equipment reported difficulty returning to normal consciousness, with some experiencing temporal displacement syndrome that made it difficult to distinguish between past, present, and future events. Dr. Sullivan established strict safety protocols for temporal viewing research, limiting exposure times and requiring extensive psychological evaluation for all volunteers. The protocols ensured that researchers could study the technology safely, while protecting participants from potentially harmful effects of consciousness expansion. Margaret Ashworth Chen provided additional family history that revealed Charles Ashworth had been aware of the potential dangers of his temporal viewing technology. Family letters indicated that he had experienced his own difficulties with temporal displacement, sometimes becoming confused about which time period he was actually living in after extended use of his equipment. According to family records, Charles Ashworth had been working on developing safety mechanisms for his temporal viewing technology when he died suddenly in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. His death had left his research incomplete, with crucial knowledge about safe operation of the equipment lost when he was unable to train successors in his methods. Dr. Sullivan's team began the painstaking process of reconstructing Charles Ashworth's safety protocols by studying his laboratory notes, experimental records, and the physical construction of his equipment. The research revealed that Ashworth had been developing consciousness stabilization techniques that would allow extended temporal viewing without risk of temporal displacement. The reconstruction work led to breakthrough discoveries about the relationship between consciousness and electromagnetic fields. Dr. Rodriguez found that specific electromagnetic frequencies could enhance or suppress different aspects of human awareness, allowing researchers to precisely control the temporal viewing experience. Dr. Foster's consciousness research revealed that individual differences in neural structure and psychological makeup determined how effectively different people could use the temporal viewing equipment. Some individuals showed natural aptitude for consciousness expansion, while others required extensive training to achieve even basic temporal viewing capabilities. The research team established training programs for developing temporal viewing abilities using Charles Ashworth's equipment in combination with modern consciousness development techniques. The programs attracted students from around the world who were interested in exploring the frontiers of human awareness and consciousness capabilities. Eleanor Ashworth's original photograph continued to serve as a focal point for temporal viewing research, with Whisker's eyes providing a stable reference point for understanding how consciousness could interact with electromagnetic fields to achieve expanded awareness. The cat's temporal reflections had become more active and detailed as research at the laboratory intensified. Dr. Sullivan documented new temporal scenes appearing in Whisker's eyes that seemed to respond to current events and the research team's interests. The cat's consciousness, preserved somehow in the photographic plate, appeared to be actively participating in the temporal viewing process by selecting and displaying relevant scenes from across time and space. The research attracted international attention from government agencies interested in the potential applications of temporal viewing technology. Representatives from intelligence organizations, military research divisions, and space agencies requested access to Charles Ashworth's equipment for national security and scientific purposes. However, the Ashworth family maintained strict control over access to the temporal viewing technology, working with Dr. Sullivan's research team to ensure that the equipment was used only for legitimate scientific research and consciousness development. They recognized that the technology represented capabilities that could be misused if it fell into the wrong hands. Dr. Sullivan established international protocols for temporal viewing research, creating guidelines that protected the technology while allowing legitimate scientific investigation. The protocols were adopted by research institutions around the world that were conducting related consciousness and temporal research. The Institute for Temporal Consciousness Studies expanded to include multiple research facilities that studied different aspects of Charles Ashworth's discoveries. Each facility focused on specific applications of temporal viewing technology, from historical research to consciousness development to theoretical physics investigation. Dr. Rodriguez's continued research revealed that Charles Ashworth's equipment was tapping into fundamental properties of consciousness that existed independently of individual human awareness. The technology appeared to be accessing what she termed the consciousness field, a universal information matrix that contained all knowledge and experience across time and space. This consciousness field theory explained how temporal viewing could provide access to events from any time period or location. Rather than traveling through time or space, consciousness was accessing information that already existed in the universal consciousness matrix, with Charles Ashworth's equipment serving as a technological interface for human awareness. Dr. Foster's research confirmed that extended use of temporal viewing technology could permanently enhance human consciousness capabilities. Volunteers who participated in long-term studies showed sustained improvements in intuition, empathy, problem-solving abilities, and awareness of subtle environmental changes. The consciousness enhancement effects suggested that Charles Ashworth's technology might represent an evolutionary tool that could accelerate human consciousness development. The equipment appeared to be designed not just for temporal viewing, but for expanding human awareness to levels that would normally require decades of meditation and consciousness training. Dr. Sullivan began investigating whether Charles Ashworth had intended his temporal viewing technology to serve as a consciousness development tool for humanity. His personal writings revealed that he had been deeply concerned about the limitations of human awareness and believed that expanded consciousness was necessary for solving global problems and advancing human civilization. Ashworth's vision had been to create technology that would allow humanity to transcend the limitations of individual consciousness and access the collective wisdom and knowledge of all human experience across time. His temporal viewing equipment represented an early attempt to create technological interfaces for universal consciousness access. The research team discovered that Charles Ashworth had been corresponding with other inventors and scientists around the world who were working on similar consciousness expansion technologies. The letters revealed an international network of researchers who believed that technological consciousness enhancement was necessary for human evolution and survival. Dr. Sullivan organized the first international conference on consciousness technology, bringing together researchers who were investigating technological methods for expanding human awareness. The conference revealed that Charles Ashworth's work had been part of a broader movement toward consciousness technology integration that had been active during the early 20th century. The conference documented similar consciousness expansion research from multiple countries, suggesting that the period between 1910 and 1920 had been particularly favorable for consciousness technology development. Several researchers had achieved various forms of technological consciousness enhancement, though none had matched the comprehensive capabilities of Charles Ashworth's temporal viewing system. Dr. Rodriguez presented theoretical work suggesting that consciousness technology development had been suppressed by social and political forces that preferred to maintain conventional limitations on human awareness. The suppression had prevented consciousness expansion technologies from reaching widespread implementation, keeping humanity locked in limited awareness states. The conference attracted criticism from religious leaders and government officials who argued that consciousness expansion technology posed threats to social stability and traditional authority structures. These critics claimed that expanded human awareness would undermine existing social hierarchies and belief systems. However, consciousness researchers argued that expanded awareness was necessary for addressing global challenges like climate change, social inequality, and international conflict that required collective wisdom and cooperation beyond current human capabilities. They maintained that consciousness technology represented humanity's best hope for evolving beyond destructive patterns that threatened planetary survival. Dr. Sullivan worked with international organizations to develop ethical guidelines for consciousness technology research and implementation. The guidelines balance the potential benefits of consciousness expansion with legitimate concerns about social stability and individual psychological health. The Institute for Temporal Consciousness Studies established training programs for consciousness technology researchers, ensuring that future scientists would have the knowledge and ethical foundation necessary for responsible consciousness expansion research. The programs attracted students from diverse backgrounds who were committed to using consciousness technology for human benefit. Eleanor Ashworth's photograph became an educational tool for demonstrating the potential of consciousness technology to transcend conventional limitations. Students could observe the temporal reflections in Whisker's eyes while learning about the theoretical principles that made technological consciousness expansion possible. Dr. Foster developed therapeutic applications for consciousness technology that helped individuals overcome trauma, develop enhanced empathy, and achieve greater self-awareness. The therapeutic programs demonstrated that consciousness expansion could provide healing benefits that complemented traditional psychological and medical treatments. The success of consciousness technology therapy led to the establishment of consciousness enhancement centers around the world that provided supervised access to consciousness expansion technology. These centers helped individuals explore expanded awareness states while ensuring psychological safety and integration of expanded consciousness experiences. Margaret Ashworth Chen became an advocate for responsible consciousness technology development, using her family's legacy to promote ethical research and implementation. She established the Charles Ashworth Foundation for Consciousness Research, which provided funding for consciousness technology studies that prioritized human welfare and social benefit. The foundation supported research into consciousness technology applications for education, conflict resolution, environmental protection, and creative problem-solving. The programs demonstrated that expanded consciousness could contribute to solutions for complex global challenges that required innovative thinking and collaborative approaches. Dr. Sullivan's research revealed that Charles Ashworth's temporal viewing technology was continuing to evolve, with the equipment showing increasing sophistication and capability as more researchers worked with it. The technology appeared to be learning from human consciousness interaction, developing new features and functions that enhanced its effectiveness. This evolutionary capability suggested that consciousness technology might be self-improving, with devices becoming more powerful and sophisticated through interaction with human awareness. The implications were profound, indicating that consciousness technology could lead to exponential expansion of human cognitive and perceptual capabilities. The research team documented cases where Charles Ashworth's equipment had provided solutions to research problems that had puzzled scientists for decades. The technology appeared to be capable of accessing information and insights that exceeded individual human knowledge, serving as an interface to collective human wisdom and understanding. Dr. Rodriguez discovered that the temporal viewing equipment could facilitate communication between consciousness researchers around the world, allowing direct awareness exchange that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. The technology provided new methods for scientific collaboration that enhanced research effectiveness and accelerated discovery. The consciousness communication capabilities led to the establishment of a global consciousness research network that connected scientists, philosophers, and consciousness explorers around the world. The network facilitated unprecedented cooperation in consciousness research while maintaining ethical standards and research integrity. Eleanor Ashworth's photograph served as a central node in the consciousness research network, with Whisker's temporal reflections providing a stable reference point for consciousness communication experiments. The cat's awareness, somehow preserved in the photographic plate, had become a bridge between different forms of consciousness and different time periods. Dr. Sullivan often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with the examination of a simple family photograph and evolved into groundbreaking research that was reshaping human understanding of consciousness, time, and technology. Eleanor and her cat had become symbols of the unlimited potential that existed when consciousness was freed from conventional limitations. The Institute for Temporal Consciousness Studies continued to grow, establishing research partnerships with universities, government agencies, and international organizations around the world. The Institute's work demonstrated that consciousness technology represented one of humanity's most promising paths towards solving global challenges and achieving sustainable civilization. As the research progressed, Dr. Sullivan began to understand that Charles Ashworth's temporal photography had been far more than a scientific achievement. It had been a gift to humanity that provided tools for consciousness evolution and expanded awareness that could transform human civilization if used wisely and ethically. The little girl holding her cat in the 1915 photograph had become proof that consciousness was capable of transcending any limitation when supported by appropriate technology and understanding. Eleanor and Whiskers had opened doorways to new forms of human potential that demonstrated the unlimited possibilities for consciousness development and technological integration. The temporal reflections in Whiskers' eyes continued to display scenes from across time and space, serving as reminders that consciousness was far more vast and capable than most people ever imagined. The cat's gaze had become a window into the infinite potential of human awareness, proving that some discoveries were powerful enough to change the fundamental nature of human existence itself. Dr. Sullivan's work with consciousness technology had demonstrated that the boundaries between science and consciousness, between technology and awareness, between time and timelessness, were far more fluid than conventional understanding suggested. Eleanor Ashworth and her temporal viewing cat had shown that consciousness was the ultimate technology, capable of achievements that exceeded the wildest dreams of conventional science when properly understood and applied. The photograph that had started as a family portrait had become a catalyst for human evolution, opening pathways to expanded consciousness that could transform civilization itself. Eleanor and Whiskers had proven that some bonds between human and animal consciousness were strong enough to transcend time, space, and the conventional limitations of awareness, creating windows into infinite possibility that would continue inspiring and empowering humanity for generations to come.